"Hey, driver, quit staring at the jet and keep the car ready." The words echoed across the private terminal with the confidence of a man who had never expected to be wrong, and several heads turned just in time to watch a silver key fob spin through the air and slide across the polished floor until it stopped inches from a pair of perfectly clean brown leather shoes. Marcus Ellington looked down, but never bent to pick it up. He stood quietly beside a small black carry-on, wearing a fitted charcoal polo, dark jeans, and sneakers that looked comfortable enough for a long day, but ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd. Richard Collins, wrapped in an expensive navy suit and sunglasses that cost more than some people's monthly rent, smiled at the people around him as if he had just delivered the funniest joke of the morning. A few businessmen laughed politely. A woman scrolling through her phone glanced up and then quickly looked away. An airport attendant hesitated for a second before continuing toward the runway. Nobody corrected the assumption. Nobody asked Marcus who he really was. The quiet terminal overlooking rows of sleek private aircraft suddenly felt smaller, charged with the invisible weight of a judgment that arrived long before any introduction. Richard adjusted his watch and shook his head. "I swear, drivers never pay attention anymore." His golf partners chuckled while one of them pointed toward a black luxury SUV parked outside. "Maybe he's new." Marcus never answered. His expression stayed calm, almost thoughtful, as sunlight reflected across the wide glass walls and painted silver lines across the marble floor. The silence somehow irritated Richard even more than an argument would have. "Did you hear me?" he asked, louder this time. "The bags aren't going to load themselves." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes, not with anger, but with the steady composure of someone who had spent years watching people reveal themselves before he ever had to speak. Across the lobby, a young attorney named Sophia Turner noticed the exchange while waiting for her own charter flight. Something about the scene felt wrong. It was not Marcus's clothes or his luggage or even his quiet confidence. It was the way everyone else had already decided who he was without hearing a single word. Richard stepped forward, pulled a folded $20 bill from his wallet, and held it out with a casual grin. "Grab us coffee while you're waiting. Keep the change." The bill floated from his fingers and landed beside the forgotten key. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the lounge, but nobody moved. Marcus looked at the money, then toward the runway where ground crews calmly prepared a gleaming white Gulf Stream beneath the bright American sky. Somewhere beyond the tinted windows, engines hummed softly, pilots completed checklists, and a flight crew reviewed the passenger manifest. None of the people laughing inside the terminal noticed that the name printed at the very top of that manifest belonged to the quiet black man they had mistaken for someone else. Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he was while the silver key and the folded $20 bill rested on the marble floor like two quiet reminders that assumptions always arrived before truth. He glanced through the towering windows toward the runway, where the polished Gulf Stream reflected the late morning sun with the calm certainty of something that never needed to prove its value. Richard Collins mistook the silence for surrender and laughed again. "See, I knew he understood eventually." One of his business partners nodded and reached for his leather briefcase. "At least somebody around here still knows how to provide service." The words drifted through the private terminal, collecting nervous smiles from strangers who preferred comfort over confrontation. Marcus simply checked the time on a stainless steel watch that had traveled with him through boardrooms, factory floors, and small community meetings across the country. He had learned years ago that the loudest opinions often belonged to people who had never bothered to ask a single question. Across the lounge, Sophia Turner watched him with growing curiosity. Drivers usually shifted uncomfortably when wealthy clients spoke to them that way. But this man stood with the relaxed posture of someone waiting for an appointment that could not begin without him. His carry-on bag was perfectly positioned beside him, his boarding folder remained closed in one hand, and his attention never wandered toward the luxury sport utility vehicle parked outside. Instead, every few moments his eyes returned to the aircraft beyond the glass. Sophia quietly closed the legal brief on her tablet. Something did not fit the picture everyone else seemed so eager to believe. Richard noticed Marcus looking toward the runway and smirked. "Do not worry, you are not flying anywhere today." His friends chuckled while an airport concierge politely walked by carrying bottled water for arriving passengers. The concierge slowed for an instant after making eye contact with Marcus, offering a respectful nod before continuing toward the executive lounge. Richard never noticed it. Neither did the men beside him. They were too busy discussing investment numbers and vacation homes to recognize quiet familiarity when it appeared right in front of them. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed a brief message, read the response, and slipped the device away without changing expression. No frustration crossed his face. No embarrassment reached his eyes. The stillness almost seemed intentional, as though he understood that every careless word spoken around him was writing a story no apology could erase. Sophia leaned slightly toward the older woman seated beside her and whispered, "Have you ever seen someone look that comfortable while being completely misunderstood?" The woman glanced at Marcus and slowly shook her head. Outside, a fuel truck rolled away from the waiting jet. Ground technicians removed the wheel chocks, and a member of the flight crew stepped onto the stairs holding a polished leather passenger manifest. The aircraft was nearly ready, and somewhere between the bright runway and the silent terminal, the difference between appearance and reality was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. Richard Collins picked up the $20 bill, brushed an invisible speck of dust from it, and held it toward Marcus again with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world always agreed with him. "Come on, earn it," he said, smiling at the small circle of executives surrounding him. "Good service deserves a tip." One man laughed loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear, while another casually pointed toward the black sport utility vehicle waiting outside the terminal entrance. "The luggage is probably getting warm." The joke floated through the executive lounge and settled into the uncomfortable silence that follows when people choose amusement over fairness. Marcus did not reach for the money. He did not answer. He simply rested one hand on the handle of his carry-on bag and looked through the glass toward the runway where the white Gulf Stream waited with quiet elegance beneath a cloudless sky. The calm expression on his face somehow frustrated Richard more than any argument could have. An airport customer service representative approached with a professional smile and politely asked whether anyone needed refreshments before boarding. Richard answered before anyone else could speak. "Maybe our driver could grab the coffee." The representative glanced toward Marcus, expecting irritation, but instead found steady eyes and an almost thoughtful smile. She hesitated for a brief second before excusing herself and walking away, sensing that something about the situation felt strangely incomplete. Sophia Turner continued watching from across the lounge. She noticed details everyone else ignored. Marcus never looked at the luxury vehicle outside. His attention stayed fixed on flight activity. He instinctively checked the weather display mounted above the reception desk when the wind direction changed. He quietly observed fuel operations and ground coordination with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours around private aviation. Those were not habits of a hired driver waiting for instructions. Richard stepped closer and casually dropped the silver key onto Marcus's carry-on bag. "At least hold on to that until we leave." The key slid down and landed softly on the polished floor beside the folded bill. Several travelers exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody laughed this time. The scene had shifted from harmless assumption to open disrespect, and even strangers could feel the change in the atmosphere. Marcus slowly picked up neither object. Instead, he checked his phone once more. A single message appeared across the screen. "Arrival sequence confirmed. Crew standing by." He locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket without the slightest change in expression. Richard shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable attitude." Sophia quietly closed her tablet and stood, unable to ignore the growing tension. Before she could take a single step, movement outside the glass walls caught everyone's attention. A line of uniformed ground personnel suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned toward the terminal entrance. The lead flight attendant adjusted her jacket. The captain stepped onto the stairs holding a leather folder, and every member of the private jet crew began walking toward the lounge with calm purpose, as though the most important passenger of the day was only seconds away from entering their view. The polished floor reflected the approaching uniforms long before anyone noticed the people wearing them. Two ground coordinators walked with measured confidence, followed by a senior flight attendant whose navy jacket seemed perfectly pressed despite the warm Florida morning, and just behind her came a captain carrying a slim leather folder against his side. Their pace was steady, professional, and unmistakably purposeful. Richard Collins saw them and smiled with renewed confidence. "Good timing," he said to his friends. "Maybe they can help this guy figure out where employees are supposed to wait." One executive laughed while another adjusted his tie and glanced toward Marcus as if expecting him to finally apologize for standing in the wrong place. Marcus remained exactly where he had been, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his carry-on bag and the other in his pocket. He watched the crew approach with the quiet familiarity of someone recognizing colleagues after a routine business trip. Sophia Turner noticed something else. Every member of the crew maintained perfect posture, but their attention never drifted toward Richard or the group of wealthy travelers surrounding him. Their eyes stayed fixed on Marcus from the moment they entered the terminal. The realization settled over her like the first drop of rain before a storm. She quietly whispered to herself, "They are not coming for the people everyone expects." Richard stepped forward anyway, extending a confident smile toward the approaching captain. "Morning, Captain. We have a small misunderstanding over here. This driver seems confused about where he belongs." The captain acknowledged the comment with a polite nod, but never slowed down. The lead flight attendant offered the same professional courtesy before continuing straight ahead. The distance between the crew and Marcus became shorter with every step, and the atmosphere inside the executive lounge changed in a way nobody could explain. Conversations faded. Coffee cups stopped halfway to waiting hands. Even the receptionist behind the marble desk looked up from her computer, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Richard finally noticed that nobody from the crew had looked at him for more than a second. His smile weakened, but he recovered quickly and reached down to pick up the silver key from the floor. He casually held it toward Marcus once again. "Here, take this before you forget what you are supposed to be doing." Marcus looked at the key and then calmly met Richard's eyes. There was no anger in his expression, only the kind of patience earned through years of seeing people measure worth by appearance instead of character. Sophia took one slow step forward and spoke just loudly enough for the nearest travelers to hear. "I do not think he is waiting for a client." Richard laughed without hesitation. "Of course he is. Look at him." Sophia never looked away from Marcus. "No," she answered quietly. "Look at everyone else." At that exact moment, the lead flight attendant stopped only a few feet away, smoothed her jacket, exchanged a respectful glance with the captain, and both of them prepared to speak while every conversation inside the private terminal disappeared into complete silence. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before Richard Collins forced another smile and slipped the folded $20 bill into the front pocket of Marcus Ellington's polo shirt as though generosity could disguise disrespect. "Lunch is on me," he said with a laugh that invited everyone else to join him. A few people managed uneasy smiles while others suddenly found the marble floor far more interesting than the exchange unfolding in front of them. Marcus calmly removed the bill, folded it once, and placed it beside the untouched silver key without saying a single word. His composure carried more weight than any argument ever could. Sophia Turner watched his expression and realized she was not looking at a man trying to avoid conflict, but at someone who had already learned long ago that dignity never needed permission from strangers. For a brief moment, the bright terminal disappeared from Marcus's thoughts, and another memory quietly returned. He was 19 years old in Chicago, finishing classes during the day and driving a black sedan through evening traffic to pay tuition. His father had handed him the keys on his first shift and smiled with quiet pride. "There is honor in every honest job," he had said. "But never let anyone convince you that your position defines your value." Marcus remembered opening doors for executives who never learned his name and carrying luggage for travelers who never looked him in the eye. He had never been ashamed of that work because it had built the discipline that later built companies, created thousands of jobs, and changed neighborhoods that banks had ignored for decades. The memory faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the polished executive terminal and the present moment. Richard casually rested a paper coffee cup on top of Marcus's carry-on bag and turned back to his friends as though the conversation had already been won. "Some people just need direction," he joked. No one laughed this time. The atmosphere had shifted into something heavier than embarrassment. Even the receptionist behind the front desk stopped typing and quietly watched the growing crowd near the windows. Outside, sunlight reflected from the nose of the waiting Gulf Stream, while technicians stepped away from the aircraft with practiced precision. A service vehicle rolled to a stop and the engines remained silent, waiting for only one final instruction before departure. Sophia took another careful step toward Marcus and softly asked, "Are you all right?" Marcus met her eyes and offered a calm smile that carried years of patience. "I have been all right for a very long time," he answered. The simple sentence settled over the room with unexpected force. Richard heard it and shrugged dismissively, convinced the quiet man in front of him had finally accepted his place. He never noticed the captain adjusting his hat, the lead flight attendant straightening her jacket, or the entire flight crew slowing together just a few feet away, each of them preparing to greet the passenger whose name they had memorized long before anyone else in the terminal had bothered to ask it. The executive terminal seemed to pause with the stillness that comes just before an important announcement. Yet Marcus Ellington remained as calm as ever, his carry-on bag resting beside him and the untouched key and folded bill still lying on the polished floor. Richard Collins glanced toward the approaching flight crew and confidently straightened his jacket, assuming they were arriving to welcome a familiar high-value client. "Now this looks more like it," he said to his companions. "Professional service." The captain continued walking without changing pace, while the lead flight attendant quietly checked the leather manifest one final time. Behind them, two ground coordinators adjusted their radios and moved into position beside the entrance leading to the runway. The receptionist behind the marble desk suddenly stood a little straighter, as though recognizing a routine reserved for only the most important passengers. Outside, the Gulf Stream shimmered beneath the afternoon sun while a catering vehicle departed, and a polished black staircase was aligned perfectly with the aircraft door. Sophia Turner noticed every small detail and felt her certainty grow stronger with every passing second. None of those preparations matched the casual departure Richard seemed to expect. They resembled the carefully synchronized movements that surrounded someone whose arrival determined everyone else's schedule. Marcus reached into his pocket and quietly unlocked his phone. A single notification appeared across the screen. "Boarding ready when you are." He typed only 3 words in reply. "I am here." Less than 5 seconds later, the lead ground coordinator received a message through his headset and gave a subtle nod toward the captain. Richard noticed Marcus putting away his phone and laughed softly. "Calling for a ride?" he asked. "That is smart, because we will be leaving soon." Marcus offered no response. His silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt deliberate, almost like an invisible line separating confidence from noise. Travelers waiting throughout the terminal slowly shifted their attention away from their own conversations and toward the unusual gathering near the windows. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A retired couple stopped discussing vacation plans. Even the barista paused while preparing an espresso, sensing that the room itself expected something significant. The lead flight attendant reached the center of the lounge and exchanged a brief glance with the captain before both stopped at exactly the same moment. Ground personnel positioned themselves several feet behind them with quiet precision. Richard smiled broadly and took one confident step forward, already preparing to introduce himself. Instead, every member of the flight crew looked past him without hesitation. Sophia watched Richard's expression change for the first time that morning as uncertainty quietly replaced certainty. Marcus gently lifted the handle of his carry-on bag, not with excitement, but with the calm familiarity of someone who had repeated this routine countless times before. Sunlight reflected across the glass walls, illuminating the silent terminal while every conversation faded away, and in that suspended moment before a single word was spoken, appearances began losing their power over everyone who had trusted them. Every eye inside the executive terminal followed the same silent line as the captain stopped, squared his shoulders, and smiled with genuine recognition. The lead flight attendant stepped forward first, her voice warm, clear, and effortless. "Good afternoon, Mr. Marcus Ellington. Welcome back. We are honored to have you with us again." Time seemed to slow across the polished lounge. The ground coordinators immediately straightened into position while the captain extended his hand with quiet respect. "Your aircraft is fully prepared, sir. We are ready for departure whenever you are." No one moved. No one reached for a phone. Even the soft music playing through the terminal suddenly felt distant beneath the weight of complete silence. Richard Collins remained frozen with the silver key still resting in his hand, his confident smile disappearing one uncertain second at a time. His business partners exchanged confused glances before looking from Marcus to the waiting Gulf Stream and back again, trying to fit reality into a story they had already written in their minds. The receptionist behind the marble desk quickly stood and nodded toward Marcus with unmistakable familiarity. "Welcome back, Mr. Ellington," she said softly. "It is wonderful to see you again." The barista behind the coffee counter did the same, remembering a traveler who always thanked every employee by name and asked about their families before every flight. Sophia Turner closed her tablet and slowly smiled. Everything she had sensed was now impossible to ignore. Marcus calmly accepted the captain's handshake and nodded to each member of the crew with the ease of long-standing professional relationships. "Thank you all," he replied. "I appreciate your work as always." The lead flight attendant glanced toward the carry-on bag resting beside him. "May I assist with your luggage, sir?" Marcus gently shook his head. "I have it." His answer was simple, respectful, and completely free of triumph. Richard finally found his voice. "Wait, you are the passenger?" The question sounded almost childlike against the quiet dignity filling the room. Marcus looked toward him without anger or satisfaction. "I have been waiting for my flight the entire time." Richard looked down at the $20 bill lying beside the untouched key and then toward the polished aircraft beyond the glass. For the first time that morning, he noticed details he had ignored before. The personalized welcome displayed on the cabin screen visible through the open door, the coordinated crew standing patiently in formation, and the ground staff who had never once mistaken who they were preparing to serve. One of Richard's associates slowly stepped back and whispered, "We never even asked his name." Sophia answered quietly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That was never the problem. You decided who he was before he had the chance to introduce himself." Marcus picked up his carry-on bag, leaving the folded bill and the silver key exactly where they had fallen, and with every calm step he took toward the waiting crew, the assumptions that had filled the terminal only minutes earlier seemed to disappear behind him like shadows that could not survive the light. Marcus Ellington walked toward the waiting crew with an unhurried confidence that seemed to slow the entire terminal around him, and every polished shoe on the marble floor suddenly felt louder than the conversations that had filled the room only moments before. The captain stepped aside with practiced courtesy while the lead flight attendant smiled and gestured toward the open doors leading to the runway. "Your preferred cabin temperature has already been set, sir, and your meeting documents are waiting inside." Marcus thanked her with the same calm respect he had shown every employee he encountered that morning. There was no victory in his voice and no desire to embarrass anyone. That quiet grace somehow made the silence behind him even heavier. Richard Collins remained standing exactly where he was until he slowly looked down and noticed the silver key resting beside the folded $20 bill. For the first time all day, he bent down, picked up the key himself, and stared at the money that had once seemed like a harmless joke. One of his business partners quietly cleared his throat. "Richard, maybe we should say something." Richard nodded, but the words refused to come. Apologies always sound simple until pride has to speak them. Sophia Turner watched the moment unfold and gently walked toward Marcus before he reached the terminal doors. "Excuse me," she said softly. Marcus turned with the same composed expression he had carried since the beginning. "I owe you an apology even though I never said a word against you," Sophia admitted. "I knew something was wrong, but I waited too long to trust my instincts." Marcus smiled with genuine kindness. Standing for respect starts whenever someone chooses to do it. That is always the right time. Sophia thanked him and stepped aside, carrying those words with her like a lesson that would stay much longer than the memory of the flight itself. Richard finally approached, stopping several feet away. His expensive suit suddenly seemed far less impressive than the quiet dignity standing in front of him. "Mr. Ellington," he began carefully, "I made an assumption that I should not have made." Marcus listened without interrupting. Richard glanced toward the Gulf Stream and then back at the terminal where dozens of strangers had witnessed the entire exchange. "I never asked your name," he admitted. Marcus nodded gently. "That happens more often than people realize." Richard lowered his eyes, and for a moment the successful executive looked like a man discovering that confidence without humility is only another form of ignorance. The captain respectfully waited without rushing the conversation while ground personnel remained perfectly still beside the aircraft. No one demanded an explanation. No one celebrated anyone's embarrassment. The terminal itself seemed to understand that the most meaningful lessons rarely arrive with raised voices. Marcus adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag and looked once more at the polished floor where the forgotten $20 bill no longer rested. Richard had quietly picked it up and folded it away, not because of its value, but because he finally understood what it represented. Some people measure others by appearance, but real character is revealed only when respect is offered before status is known, and that truth lingered in the quiet terminal long after every spoken word had faded. Marcus Ellington stepped through the open terminal doors as a gentle breeze crossed the runway and carried the quiet sound of waiting engines across the afternoon air, and the polished Gulf Stream stood ahead like a promise that never needed to announce its worth. The captain walked beside him, while the lead flight attendant welcomed him aboard with the same sincere professionalism she offered every journey, proving that true respect is shown through consistency rather than circumstance. Before climbing the stairs, Marcus paused and looked back one final time, not to celebrate a misunderstanding corrected, but to acknowledge the people whose expressions had changed more than the situation itself. Sophia Turner offered a small nod that carried gratitude and determination, knowing she would never again allow uncertainty to silence fairness when she witnessed it. Richard Collins remained near the terminal entrance with the silver key resting quietly in his palm. The confidence that had once filled every sentence was gone, replaced by thoughtful silence. He watched Marcus preparing to board and slowly realized that he had spent years believing success could always be recognized by expensive suits, loud introductions, and familiar faces, while the person he had dismissed carried none of those signals and yet possessed something much greater. One of his business partners quietly asked, "Do you know what his company does?" Richard looked toward the aircraft and answered honestly, "No, I never even asked." The words lingered in the warm afternoon air as the ground crew completed the final checks and the cabin door remained open for its honored passenger. Marcus noticed Richard standing alone and walked back only a few steps, close enough to be heard without forcing anyone else to listen. His voice stayed calm and steady. "My father drove people for a living, and he taught me that every honest job deserves respect. The problem was never being mistaken for a driver. The problem was believing a driver deserved less dignity than anyone else." Richard lowered his eyes, understanding that the lesson reached far beyond a single conversation in an airport terminal. Marcus offered a polite smile, turned once more, and climbed the stairs without another word. The crew welcomed him aboard. The door closed smoothly, and moments later the aircraft began moving toward the runway with quiet confidence. Through the terminal windows, every traveler watched the white jet accelerate beneath the bright American sky until it lifted gracefully into the distance, leaving behind only reflections on polished marble and a silence filled with new understanding. Sophia gathered her tablet and walked toward her own gate carrying a story she would remember for years. The receptionist returned to work with a renewed appreciation for every guest who crossed the lobby. Richard slipped the unused $20 bill into his wallet as a reminder rather than a convenience, determined never again to confuse appearance with ability or clothing with character. High above the clouds, Marcus opened his notebook for the meeting ahead, his attention already focused on creating opportunities for people who had once been underestimated just as he had. He never raised his voice, never demanded recognition, and never needed to prove his worth, because true leadership is not revealed by who calls you important, but by how you treat people long before you know their name. And that quiet truth traveled farther than any private jet ever could.